This week's Parashat Titzaveh. The Parashat discusses the garments of the priests, Big Day Kuna. 29th chapter discusses the inauguration of the Mishkan, the dedication of the Mishkan, the Miluim. At the end of that section, the Torah says, in describing the Mishkan, V'shachanti b'toch b'nei Yisrael v'yiti lehem le'elohim. I will dwell amongst the children of Israel. I will be for them a God. V'yadu, and they will know, Ki ani Hashem Elokehem asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim l'shachni b'tocham ani Hashem Elokehem. They will know that I am the God who took them out of Egypt for the purpose of dwelling amongst them. I am their God. Ani Hashem Elokehem. From that pasuk, it sounds like the purpose of the Mishkan is in order that they know. Somehow through the Mishkan they will know that I am the God who took them out of Egypt for the purpose of dwelling amongst them. And the question that can be raised is, how does the Mishkan give one this knowledge? How is the Mishkan a source of knowledge? So there are various possible ways to understand it. One could explain it. One could say that if one looks at the Mishkan, one studies the vessels of the Mishkan, perhaps one, through the very Mishkan itself, can attain a certain amount of knowledge of God. One could equally say that knowledge here does not refer to an intellectual knowledge, but that knowledge refers to an experience. The very fact of being in God's presence gives one a knowledge of God, gives one an understanding of God. I would suggest the third possibility. It's interesting that earlier in the book of Shemot, when God speaks of God's plan to take Israel out of Egypt, in chapter 6, there the Torah says that God spoke to Moshe and said, L'chein emor l'bnei Yisrael ani Hashem, is chapter 6, in the 6th pasuk. V'yotzeti etchem mitachat sivlot Mitzrayim, v'yitzalti etchem mi'avodatam, v'ga'alti etchem b'zroa netuya v'shvatim gedolim, v'lakachti etchem li li'am, v'yiti lechem le'elokim v'yadu, ki ani Hashem Elokehem, hamotzi etchem mitachat sivlot Mitzrayim, v'yiveti etchem l'aretz, asher nasati et yadi l'teit ota li'Avraham li'Yitzchak li'Yaakov, v'natati ota lechem morasha ani Hashem. There the Torah speaks of God, who says to Moshe, God's plan, I will take them out, v'otzeti, I will save them, v'itzalti, I will redeem them, v'ga'alti, I will bring them to me, says God, v'lakachti etchem li liyam, and afterwards, v'yadu, they will know, followed by, I will bring them into the land. There too, one could say that v'lakachti etchem li liyam refers to God bringing us to God, paraphrased by the words later, when God speaks of bringing us to Mount Sinai. I have brought you to me, says God. And after Sinai, and before we enter the land, we know through the Mishkan. How do we know? The purpose of the Mishkan, argues the Ramban, was primarily a place where God continues to communicate to Israel. God speaks through the Mishkan. The Mishkan is known in the Torah not just as a Mishkan, but as an Olam Moed, a place of meeting. And from where does God speak? The Torah says that God speaks from above the ark, between the two kruvim, between the cherubs, mi bein shnei kruvim, v'no'adati l'chasham. I will meet you there, says God. I will continue to speak to you between the kruvim. In fact, in Parashat Titzaveh, just a few verses earlier, in chapter 29, the Torah says that v'no'adati shama l'vnei Yisrael. There I will meet. I will meet you there, says God. So the Mishkan is a place where God continues to speak, to teach, to command. What is the nature of God's command? In the Parashat Mishpatim, the Torah speaks of a Sefer HaBrit, a book of the covenant. The laws of Mishpatim together comprise the book of the covenant. And if one studies the laws of Mishpatim, one realizes that the emphasis in these laws is about not mistreating the people on the margins, not oppressing the widow. And the Torah says, "Imaneta neotam." If you do oppress the widow, the orphan, I'm certainly going to punish you, says God. God is at that point not simply a lawgiver, but God is an angry God. God cares deeply about that. God mentions twice in that parsha to be careful about the stranger, the ger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And then the Torah adds a few verses later, you know how the stranger feels, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. In other words, through the nature of the command, we understand something about the one who gives the commands. And in particular, the commands of the Book of the Covenant, of the previous parsha, reflect upon the very experience of leaving Egypt. In fact, the first of the Mishpatim is all about slavery. It's about curtailing slavery, limiting slavery. Slavery is only 6 years. The female slave, one is supposed to marry, if married, to treat her as a wife, if not married, to free her. So through the nature of the command, which comes from the Mishkan, the ongoing commands of God, we understand, says the Torah, you will understand, you will know that I am the God who took you out of Egypt. You'll understand the nature of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and to the extent that we can understand it, the nature of this commander, the nature of the God who was so concerned about the oppressed people of Egypt. We understand it through the Mishkan and through the ongoing command. Shabbat Shalom.